Some people don't need to say a single cruel word to make you feel unwelcome. They simply pretend you don't exist. The first notes of the string quartet floated through the white marble chapel just as Naomi Carter stepped quietly inside, the soft heels of her navy blue shoes barely making a sound against the polished stone floor. Sunlight spilled through towering stained glass windows, painting ribbons of gold, sapphire, and crimson across rows of ivory chairs dressed with white roses and eucalyptus garlands. The wedding looked like something lifted from the pages of a luxury magazine, every crystal chandelier sparkling above hundreds of elegantly dressed guests who laughed behind champagne flutes and whispered beneath perfectly tailored suits and designer dresses. Naomi paused near the entrance, holding a small weathered wooden box close against her chest. It wasn't wrapped with ribbons or decorated with expensive paper. The walnut surface carried years of careful handling, its corners softened by time, while delicate brass hinges reflected the morning light. Across the lid, carved in neat letters worn smooth by countless fingertips, were only 2 words, "For Ethan." She took a slow breath before walking farther into the room. Almost immediately, conversations changed. They didn't stop completely. They simply shifted, like a breeze changing direction before a storm. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. Then one by one, they looked away again, each person pretending to be fascinated by something else. A woman suddenly adjusted the flowers on her table. 2 businessmen became deeply interested in their phones. Another guest leaned toward her husband, whispering behind a polite smile while glancing toward Naomi without ever truly looking at her. The silence surrounding her somehow felt louder than the music itself. Near the aisle, a little girl with curly blonde hair smiled innocently as Naomi passed, but before she could wave, her mother gently touched her shoulder and guided her a few steps away without saying a word. Naomi noticed. She always noticed. Yet her expression never changed. Years had taught her that dignity often spoke louder than explanations. She simply continued walking, careful not to disturb anyone, her posture calm, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes carrying neither anger nor embarrassment. At the back of the chapel, an usher wearing white gloves offered programs to arriving guests with effortless warmth until Naomi reached him. His practiced smile faded for the briefest moment. "May I help you?" he asked politely, though his eyes drifted toward the wooden box instead of her face. Naomi returned a gentle smile. "I'm here for Ethan Brooks." The usher hesitated. "Are you, family?" Before she could answer, another guest brushed past her, drawing the usher's attention away as though the conversation had already ended. Naomi nodded softly to herself and stepped aside without complaint. Around her, people filled every seat in the chapel except those nearest to where she quietly stood. Empty chairs remained untouched, yet no one invited her to sit. The distance wasn't measured in feet. It was measured in assumptions. Somewhere beyond the floral arch, hidden behind closed oak doors, the groom was preparing to begin the happiest day of his life. No one inside the chapel seemed to realize that the quiet black woman standing alone near the last row carried something far more valuable than an ordinary wedding gift. And before the vows were spoken, before the music reached its final chorus, before anyone understood why Ethan Brooks kept glancing toward the entrance instead of the altar, every whispered judgment inside that beautiful room would begin to unravel. Naomi remained near the last row, her fingers resting lightly against the smooth wooden box as the chapel slowly filled with the last wave of arriving guests. Every few moments someone glanced in her direction, curiosity flickering across carefully composed faces before disappearing behind practiced smiles. They searched their memories, trying to place her among the city's influential families, charitable foundations, business circles, or country clubs, but they found nothing that fit the picture they had already painted in their minds. To them, she was simply a stranger who seemed out of place inside a celebration built on wealth, prestige, and carefully curated appearances. Naomi had grown familiar with that look years ago. It was the expression people wore when they decided who someone was before hearing a single word. She never argued with it anymore. She simply waited for time to tell its own story. Her eyes drifted toward the altar where white orchids framed a polished oak cross beneath a canopy of warm candlelight. The fragrance of fresh flowers mixed gently with the scent of polished cedar and expensive perfume, creating an atmosphere that felt almost dreamlike. Somewhere behind the closed doors leading to the bridal suite, laughter echoed softly before fading once again into the quiet melody of the string quartet. Naomi smiled to herself, remembering another sound entirely. 20 years earlier, Ethan had laughed exactly like that while chasing paper airplanes across the tiny living room of a modest brick house on the outskirts of Charlotte. He had been no taller than the kitchen table then, his sneakers always untied, his endless questions filling every corner of the little home with life. The memory warmed her heart for only a moment before she returned to the present. She had promised herself that today belonged to Ethan, not to the past. She had not come seeking recognition, gratitude, or attention. She had come because some promises were too important to break. The wooden box felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of everything it carried inside. It held no jewelry, no expensive heirloom, and no envelope filled with cash. Instead, it protected fragments of a life that only two people in the world fully understood. Naomi gently brushed her thumb across the carved letters on the lid, almost as if reassuring the memories sleeping inside that they would soon find their rightful owner. A hotel employee approached carrying a silver tray filled with glasses of sparkling water. He offered refreshments to every nearby guest before moving past Naomi without noticing her. Seconds later he stopped, turned back with an embarrassed smile, and quietly extended the tray toward her. Naomi accepted one glass with genuine gratitude, thanking him so warmly that the young man seemed surprised by her kindness. As he walked away, he glanced back once, puzzled by the quiet dignity she carried so effortlessly. Across the room, Margaret Bennett watched the exchange from beside the front row, her perfectly tailored cream-colored suit matching every elegant detail surrounding her. Her eyes settled on Naomi with growing concern rather than compassion. She leaned toward one of the wedding coordinators, whispering something that caused the young woman to nod before disappearing quickly toward the entrance. Naomi noticed the movement without reacting. She had expected questions eventually. She simply had not expected them to arrive before the ceremony had even begun. Even so, she stood peacefully beneath the stained glass, sunlight warming one side of her face while the little wooden box remained safely against her heart, waiting patiently for the moment when its true purpose would finally be revealed. The wedding coordinator crossed the chapel with measured confidence, smoothing the front of her charcoal blazer before stopping a respectful distance from Naomi. She offered the kind of professional smile perfected through years of handling difficult situations without raising her voice. "Good morning, ma'am," she said gently. "My name is Rebecca. I just wanted to confirm your invitation." Naomi met her eyes with quiet warmth and nodded. "I understand." She reached into the pocket of her handbag, but before she could remove anything, Rebecca quickly added, "There seems to be a little confusion about the seating arrangements." Naomi paused, sensing the careful wording behind the polite tone. "Would you mind waiting in the reception lounge until we sort everything out?" Around them, conversations softened just enough for nearby guests to listen without appearing obvious. Margaret Bennett remained near the front of the chapel, watching every movement with composed precision. She folded her hands neatly in front of her as though she were simply overseeing another detail of the ceremony, yet her attention never left Naomi. One guest leaned toward another and whispered, "She probably came to the wrong wedding." Another quietly replied, "I heard there are 2 ceremonies happening at the estate today." Someone else glanced toward the wooden box and murmured, "Maybe she is delivering something." The explanations grew more comfortable than the possibility that Naomi belonged there. Naomi looked briefly toward the reception lounge before returning her attention to Rebecca. "I appreciate your kindness," she answered softly. "But Ethan asked me to be here before the ceremony begins." Rebecca hesitated. The certainty in Naomi's voice did not sound rehearsed or defensive. It sounded like someone repeating a simple fact. Still, the coordinator had received clear instructions from the bride's family, and those instructions left little room for uncertainty. I completely understand, Rebecca replied carefully. If you could just wait a few minutes, I will personally speak with the groom's team. Naomi nodded without protest. Of course. She stepped away from the aisle and quietly positioned herself beside a tall window overlooking the estate gardens. Outside, rows of white folding chairs stretched across perfectly trimmed lawns beneath towering oak trees draped with strings of delicate lights waiting for the evening reception. Beyond them, a peaceful lake reflected the bright Carolina sky, its surface disturbed only by a gentle breeze. Naomi watched the ripples with calm eyes, remembering another lake years ago where a frightened little boy had once refused to let go of her hand because he was afraid of deep water. She smiled faintly at the memory before lowering her gaze back to the wooden box. Inside the bridal suite upstairs, Olivia Bennet admired herself in the full-length mirror while bridesmaids adjusted the final details of her veil. She noticed her mother entering the room with unusual urgency. "Is everything all right?" Olivia asked. Margaret forced a reassuring smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Everything is under control," she answered. "There is simply an unexpected guest downstairs." Olivia frowned slightly. "Someone Ethan invited?" Margaret looked away for the briefest moment. "That is exactly what I intend to find out." Down in the chapel, Rebecca disappeared through a side hallway toward the groom's preparation room, her pace quickening with every step. Naomi remained exactly where she was, sunlight surrounding her in quiet gold as guests continued pretending not to notice the woman who seemed completely at peace standing alone. None of them realized that upstairs, only a few doors away, the answer they were searching for was already reaching for his wedding jacket while asking a question that would soon change the entire atmosphere of the day. "Has Naomi arrived yet?" Rebecca reached the groom's preparation suite just as Ethan Brooks finished fastening the last button of his ivory tuxedo jacket. His best man was adjusting a navy silk pocket square while a photographer quietly captured candid moments before the ceremony. The room carried an atmosphere of excitement mixed with nervous anticipation, but Ethan immediately noticed the unusual expression on Rebecca's face. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She hesitated only a second. "There is a guest downstairs who says you personally asked her to arrive before the ceremony." Ethan looked up instantly. "Naomi?" Rebecca blinked in surprise. "Yes. Naomi Carter." Relief spread across Ethan's face so naturally that everyone else in the room noticed it. Thank goodness she made it. He reached instinctively toward the door before his best man gently reminded him that tradition suggested the groom remain out of sight until the ceremony. Ethan stopped, smiling to himself. "Please make sure she is comfortable," he said warmly. "She is the most important guest here." Rebecca stood speechless for a brief moment before nodding quickly and leaving the suite. She replayed his words several times while walking back through the hallway. The most important guest. Downstairs, Naomi had quietly moved closer to the chapel entrance after noticing a young flower girl standing alone beside one of the marble columns. The little girl's basket had tipped over, scattering delicate white rose petals across the polished floor. Several adults walked around the petals without noticing, too occupied with conversations, photographs, and final preparations. Naomi gently set the wooden box on a nearby table before kneeling beside the child. "Would you like a little help?" she asked softly. The little girl nodded with watery eyes. Together they carefully gathered every petal, Naomi smiling as she placed them back inside the tiny woven basket. "There," she whispered. "Now they are ready to make the aisle beautiful again." The child smiled brightly. "Thank you." Before either of them could stand, the girl's mother hurried over, clearly flustered. "Emma, sweetheart, everyone has been looking for you." She reached for her daughter's hand, then paused as she noticed Naomi. "Oh." Her expression shifted into polite uncertainty. Emma looked up at her mother. "She helped me." The woman forced a courteous smile. "That was very nice of you." Then, almost instinctively, she guided Emma away before another word could be exchanged. Naomi simply watched them leave, her gentle smile never fading. She picked up the wooden box once more and brushed a tiny rose petal from its lid. Across the chapel, Margaret Bennet had witnessed the entire exchange. To her, every additional moment Naomi remained inside the ceremony felt increasingly uncomfortable. She approached two members of the estate security team, speaking quietly enough that nearby guests could not hear. Neither guard appeared aggressive. They simply listened carefully before nodding with professional courtesy and walking calmly toward the back of the chapel. Naomi noticed them approaching long before they reached her. She neither stepped away nor tightened her grip on the box. Instead, she stood peacefully beneath the warm morning light streaming through the stained glass. One of the guards offered a respectful smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Would you mind coming with us for just a moment? We would like to clear up a small misunderstanding before the ceremony begins." Naomi looked toward the altar, then back at the two men. Her voice remained calm and gracious. "If that is what you need, I will gladly cooperate." She took one quiet step forward. At that exact moment, Rebecca hurried through the chapel doors, her breathing slightly uneven after climbing the staircase twice. Her eyes immediately found Naomi, and before the guards could speak again, she called out with unmistakable urgency, "Please wait. Mr. Brooks has already answered the question." Rebecca's voice carried across the chapel with enough urgency to draw every nearby conversation into silence. The two security officers stopped immediately and turned toward her. She approached with measured breaths, offering an apologetic smile to Naomi before addressing the guards. "Mr. Brooks confirmed that Miss Carter is expected," she said. "He specifically asked that she be made comfortable." One of the officers nodded politely and stepped back without hesitation. "Thank you for letting us know." The misunderstanding appeared ready to dissolve, but before the atmosphere could settle, Margaret Bennet crossed the aisle with calm determination. Every graceful step echoed softly against the marble floor. She smiled for the benefit of watching guests, yet her eyes remained fixed on Rebecca. "There must be some mistake," Margaret said in a voice polished by years of hosting charity galas and board meetings. "My future son-in-law has many responsibilities today. Perhaps he misunderstood who you were asking about." Rebecca straightened her posture. "Mrs. Bennet, he mentioned Miss Carter by name." A faint ripple spread through the surrounding guests. They looked from Margaret to Naomi and back again, sensing that something larger than simple confusion was unfolding. Margaret maintained her composed expression, although the corners of her smile had grown noticeably tighter. "Then I would like to speak with Ethan personally before we continue." She turned toward Naomi with impeccable courtesy. "I hope you understand. Today is an emotional day for everyone." Naomi answered with the same quiet dignity she had shown since arriving. "I understand completely." There was no resentment in her voice, only patience. That calmness somehow unsettled the room more than anger ever could have. Most people expected embarrassment, frustration, or a defensive explanation. Instead they found a woman who seemed perfectly willing to let the truth arrive at its own pace. As Margaret prepared to leave for the groom's suite, a sudden burst of laughter drifted through the open courtyard doors. A young ring-bearer had accidentally chased his satin pillow into the garden after a playful gust of wind lifted one of the ribbons. Several adults watched with amused smiles but made no move to help, unwilling to wrinkle formal clothing moments before the ceremony. Naomi quietly set her wooden box on a nearby chair and walked toward the little boy. She retrieved the pillow before it reached a decorative fountain, carefully straightened the ribbon, brushed away a few blades of grass, and knelt to hand it back. "There you go," she said gently. "Now it looks perfect again." The boy grinned. "Thank you, ma'am." His father hurried over, clearly relieved, but as soon as he noticed Naomi, his grateful smile became restrained. "Thank you," he said politely before guiding his son back toward the wedding party. Naomi simply wished them a wonderful ceremony and returned to collect her wooden box. She never noticed the elderly groundskeeper watching from beneath a nearby oak tree. He had worked at the estate for nearly 30 years and had quietly observed every interaction since her arrival. Unlike many others, he saw not how people looked at Naomi, but how Naomi looked at everyone else. Every person she met received kindness that asked for nothing in return. Inside the chapel, the music softened as guests began taking their seats for what they believed would be the final preparations. Yet an uneasy anticipation lingered beneath every whispered conversation. Upstairs, Margaret walked briskly toward Ethan's suite, convinced that a brief conversation would resolve the situation once and for all. She raised her hand, knocked twice, and opened the door without waiting. Ethan turned toward her with an easy smile that disappeared the moment she spoke. "Ethan," Margaret said carefully, "I need you to tell me exactly why Naomi Carter is here today." Instead of answering immediately, Ethan looked past her toward the hallway, as though searching for someone who should have already been standing beside him. Margaret closed the door behind her, lowering her voice as though privacy could somehow soften the weight of her question. "Ethan, I am simply trying to protect today. None of us knows who that woman really is." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, surprise slowly giving way to quiet disappointment. "I know exactly who Naomi is," he answered. "The better question is why no one bothered to ask her." The room fell still. Even his best man looked down, sensing that this conversation reached far beyond wedding logistics. Margaret folded her hands together. "Then explain it to me." Ethan glanced toward the garment bag hanging beside the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beyond it. Outside, the late morning breeze carried gentle waves across the estate lake, bending the branches of ancient oak trees that had stood there for generations. He spoke almost to himself. "Some people spend their lives chasing recognition. She spent hers making sure I never needed to." Margaret frowned, uncertain whether she was hearing an answer or a memory. Before she could respond, Ethan checked his watch. "Please tell Rebecca to keep Naomi here. I will come for her myself." Margaret hesitated, searching his face for uncertainty, but found none. She quietly left the room, carrying more questions than answers. Downstairs, the atmosphere inside the chapel had settled into an uneasy silence. The musicians paused to tune their instruments, allowing the room to breathe between melodies. Guests returned to their conversations, yet every few moments another curious glance drifted toward the woman standing near the stained glass window. Naomi seemed untouched by the attention. She slowly walked toward a side table where candles flickered beneath framed family photographs from Ethan and Olivia's childhood. One picture caught her eye. Ethan looked about 8 years old, smiling with missing front teeth while proudly holding a homemade wooden birdhouse covered in uneven blue paint. Naomi smiled before anyone else noticed. She remembered helping him sand every rough edge on that tiny project until his hands were covered in sawdust and determination. "It does not have to be perfect," she had told him back then. "It only has to be built with love." The memory lingered warmly before fading into the quiet music returning through the chapel. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. "Beautiful picture, is it not?" Naomi turned to find the elderly groundskeeper standing nearby with his weathered straw hat resting respectfully against his chest. "It certainly is," she replied. The old man studied her for a moment. "Funny thing about photographs," he said with a soft smile. "Sometimes they tell you who is standing in the frame. Sometimes they remind you who stood just outside it." Naomi's eyes met his, and for the first time that morning someone looked at her without assumption, curiosity, or judgment. She simply nodded. "That is very true." Neither of them spoke again. They simply stood together as sunlight slowly shifted across the marble floor, stretching long ribbons of amber beneath the rows of white chairs. The chapel no longer felt rushed. It felt suspended, as though time itself had decided to wait. Every whispered conversation softened. Every crystal chandelier shimmered gently above the gathering. Somewhere upstairs a church bell chimed the half-hour, its deep tone rolling through the building like a quiet heartbeat. Naomi rested one hand upon the wooden box, taking a slow breath. She had carried this moment inside her heart for many years, yet now that it stood only minutes away, she felt no excitement, no fear, and no desire to prove anything. She only hoped Ethan would be happy. Beyond the closed doors leading to the preparation suites, footsteps echoed steadily down the hallway. They belonged to someone no longer willing to let others speak on his behalf, and with each measured step, the distance between hidden truth and public understanding grew smaller. The chapel doors opened without fanfare, yet the quiet sound of polished wood moving against polished stone seemed to ripple through every corner of the room. Conversations faded one by one until only the soft hum of the string quartet remained. Ethan Brooks stepped into the aisle, still wearing the calm smile that had carried him through an emotional morning, but there was something different in his eyes now. He was not looking toward the altar where everyone expected him to stand. He was searching the back of the chapel. When he finally saw Naomi beside the stained glass window, his shoulders relaxed as though a burden he had carried for years had suddenly become lighter. Without hesitation, he walked past the first row of honored guests. He passed the executives who had flown across the country to celebrate with him. He passed old family friends, respected judges, business partners, and members of the Bennett family who exchanged puzzled glances as he continued farther down the aisle. Every polished shoe striking the marble floor echoed with quiet certainty. Margaret watched in disbelief. Olivia, standing near the entrance to the bridal suite with her father, followed Ethan's gaze until she finally saw the woman everyone else had spent the morning trying to understand. The musicians slowly lowered their bows, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding before the ceremony had even begun. Ethan stopped only a few feet from Naomi. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. They simply looked at one another, years of shared memories passing silently between them. Naomi smiled with the same warmth she had carried since the day she first met a frightened little boy who believed the world had forgotten him. Ethan's voice was quiet enough that those closest leaned forward to hear. "I was beginning to worry you would not make it." Naomi let out a soft laugh. "I promised you I would be here." Ethan nodded once, emotion gently filling his eyes before he looked toward the wooden box she still held so carefully. "You kept it all these years." Naomi rested her hand across the lid. "Some things are never meant to be forgotten." Then, before anyone could understand what was happening, Ethan did something no one in the chapel expected. He stepped closer and wrapped both arms around Naomi in a long, grateful embrace. The room fell completely silent. Guests who had spent the morning avoiding her now stared in astonishment. Margaret lowered her hands. Rebecca quietly smiled through gathering tears. Even the elderly groundskeeper removed his hat in quiet respect. When Ethan finally stepped back, he gently took the wooden box from Naomi's hands and turned toward the hundreds of waiting faces. "I think all of you deserve to know why. I could never imagine getting married without this woman standing beside me today." He slowly opened the weathered lid. Inside rested a faded photograph of a smiling little boy holding a wooden birdhouse, a small bronze military service medal carefully wrapped in blue velvet, several neatly folded handwritten letters, and a worn pair of tiny children's sneakers whose white canvas had long ago faded to soft gray. A quiet murmur moved through the chapel. Ethan lifted the photograph first, holding it carefully between both hands. "Every person in this room has asked who Naomi Carter is," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. He looked toward Naomi before speaking the words that transformed every assumption made that morning into silence. "She is not here because she was invited out of kindness. She is here because without her, there would never have been a groom standing at this altar today." The silence lingered for several heartbeats after Ethan's words settled over the chapel. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered another assumption. Every eye remained fixed on the weathered wooden box resting in his hands. Ethan carefully lifted the faded photograph higher so everyone could see the smiling little boy with untied sneakers proudly holding a crooked blue birdhouse beside a younger Naomi whose smile reflected quiet pride instead of recognition. "I was 8 years old when my mother passed away," Ethan said gently. "My father was deployed overseas, and for a long time I believed I had been forgotten by the world. His voice never rose, yet every sentence carried effortlessly through the still room. Naomi never promised to replace anyone. She simply promised that I would never have to eat dinner alone, celebrate another birthday by myself, or wonder whether somebody cared if I came home safely from school. He reached back into the box and unfolded one of the carefully preserved letters. The paper had yellowed with age, its edges softened by countless readings. She wrote these to my father every month while he served our country. Every report card. Every school play. Every little league game. She wanted him to know that his son was growing up surrounded by love instead of loneliness. Ethan carefully placed the letter back inside before lifting the small bronze military medal wrapped in blue velvet. When my father returned home, this was the only thing he insisted Naomi keep. He told her that courage was not measured by a uniform alone. Sometimes courage looked like working 2 jobs, paying bills nobody else saw, and still finding enough strength to help a frightened little boy believe tomorrow would be better than today. Across the chapel, Margaret slowly lowered her eyes. Every confident conclusion she had reached that morning now felt painfully small beside the quiet truth standing only a few feet away. Olivia stepped forward, her eyes glistening as she looked at Naomi with growing admiration instead of curiosity. "Ethan," she whispered softly, "why have I never met her?" Ethan smiled with gentle understanding. Because Naomi never wanted credit for loving someone. She believed love did not become more valuable just because other people applauded it. The words settled deeply throughout the chapel. Naomi lowered her gaze for a moment, almost embarrassed by the attention. She had never imagined that the ordinary sacrifices of everyday life would become the center of a room filled with strangers. Ethan closed the wooden box carefully before turning back toward her. "For years, I asked her to let me tell this story," he said. Every single time she answered the same way. Naomi smiled and quietly finished the sentence with him. "Just become a good man. That will be enough." Ethan nodded, his voice unsteady for the first time that morning. "I spent my whole life trying." He extended one hand toward Naomi. "Today, I have one more promise to keep." Naomi accepted his hand with quiet grace. Ethan turned toward the front of the chapel where Olivia was already waiting with a warm smile. Without hesitation, Olivia walked down the aisle herself and gently embraced Naomi. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving the world the man I am about to marry." Tears quietly filled many eyes throughout the chapel, yet Naomi only shook her head with humble kindness. "He became that man because he chose kindness every single day," she replied softly. "I only reminded him that he already carried it inside his heart." No one applauded. No one interrupted the stillness. In that quiet moment, respect arrived naturally where judgment had once stood, and the room that had spent the morning trying to decide whether Naomi belonged now understood that she had belonged long before anyone else had entered the chapel. For several quiet moments, no one moved. The chapel seemed transformed, not by decorations or music, but by a truth that had gently rearranged every heart inside it. Sunlight poured through the stained glass once again, scattering warm ribbons of gold and blue across the marble floor where Naomi now stood beside Ethan and Olivia. The same room that had greeted her with uncertain glances now held only silent respect. Margaret Bennett slowly stepped away from the front row. The confidence that had guided every decision she made that morning had given way to humility. She stopped in front of Naomi, her hands clasped gently together. There was no speech prepared for this moment, no polished expression worthy of a charity banquet or formal reception. There was only honesty. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "I judged you before I ever knew you. I saw what I expected to see instead of taking the time to see who you truly were. I am deeply sorry." The apology settled into the stillness without fanfare. Naomi looked at Margaret with the same calm kindness she had shown since arriving. She smiled softly and reached forward, placing one reassuring hand over Margaret's folded hands. "We all see the world through the stories we have already heard," Naomi answered gently. "The important thing is choosing to listen when a new story begins." Margaret lowered her eyes, grateful for a grace she knew she had not earned. Nearby, guests quietly exchanged thoughtful glances. Some remembered avoiding the empty seats near Naomi. Others remembered their whispered assumptions. One by one, several people approached simply to introduce themselves, not because they wished to erase the past few hours, but because they finally understood that dignity begins with seeing another person completely. The elderly groundskeeper smiled quietly beneath the chapel doors, watching the gathering with peaceful satisfaction before returning to his work among the gardens. Rebecca, the wedding coordinator, carefully adjusted the ceremony schedule with a relieved smile, knowing that the only delay anyone would remember from this day had become its greatest blessing. Ethan then turned toward the first row and gently carried the weathered wooden box to a place of honor beside the family candles. He did not hide it away. He wanted everyone present to remember that the greatest treasures in life rarely arrived wrapped in expensive paper. They arrived through ordinary acts of faithfulness repeated over many ordinary days. Olivia slipped her arm through Naomi's as the music quietly began again. "Would you walk with us?" she asked. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together they turned toward the altar, not as strangers separated by appearance, background, or status, but as three lives forever connected by love that had expected nothing in return. As the ceremony finally began, every guest rose to their feet. This time, the standing ovation was not for wealth, elegance, or tradition. It was for quiet character that had remained steady when no one was watching. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of blooming roses across the peaceful lake, and the reflections on the water shimmered beneath the Carolina sky with gentle simplicity. Long after the vows had been spoken and the celebration had continued into laughter and music, many people would struggle to remember the color of the flowers or the flavor of the wedding cake. But they would never forget the woman who entered the chapel alone carrying nothing more than a small wooden box and a lifetime of quiet love. And whenever they remembered that day, they would remember something even greater than a wedding. They would remember that true greatness never asks to be noticed. It simply keeps choosing kindness until the truth finally speaks for itself.